And will you please offer from your own homes the blessing for the study of sacred wisdom, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Today we are picking up in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avot. We're going to begin with Mishnah number 15, which will complete the numeric mnemonics, the tongue twister that I presented you last week, that describes the format and structure for chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot. Up until this Mishnah, which is designated, at least in this edition and Safaria online, as number 15 in the 5th chapter. Up until now, all of the learning, all of the teachings have been framed as easy to memorize, simple axioms that have some kind of numeric designation, such as groups of 10, groups of 7, and now, as we're seeing, groups of 4. And the groupings of 4 tend to represent a set of statements by the rabbis on character traits or personal attributes of different kinds. We looked at kinds of temperament, kinds of attitudes that can also be extrapolated out to social groupings, economic theory even. And then today, where we're picking up with the very last, is, as might be expected for a rabbinic teaching, and I would say the paradigmatic rabbinic teaching, the rabbinic teaching par excellence, this is about kinds of learners. Again, the more I've studied Pirkei Avot with you over the last almost 2 years, I think, the more I've come to feel convinced that the purpose of Pirkei Avot as a rabbinic training manual for young rabbis or up-and-coming rabbis is given evidence all over the place. So the more I read Pirkei Avot, the more I say, yeah, this feels like a rabbinic training manual. So here we have a statement that may be about rabbis speaking to rabbis as fellow learners, because every good teacher is also a good learner, but also and especially to help rabbis in training develop an awareness of and conversancy with different kinds of learners whom they are likely to encounter. So let us begin right away. So this is Pirkei Avot chapter 5, Mishnah number 15. Arba midot, which is the way all of these have begun over the last several Mishnayot. Arba midot, there are 4 kinds, types, measures. Arba midot biyoshvim lifnei chachamim. So literally those who sit, yoshvim, may sound a lot like its corollary word with the Aramaic format in the 4 questions of the Passover Haggadah. Ben yoshvinu, ven misubin. In the part of the 4 questions, it says, why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights we sit, yoshvin. Here, sit, yoshvim. Ben yoshvinu, ven misubin. We have the meal either sitting upright like I am now, or there's my left, reclining. Bein misubin. So yoshvim just comes from the Hebrew word yoshev, meaning to sit. It's also the root of a word that you know, which is yeshiva or yeshiva. Yeshiva is a place where you sit and learn. So the act of sitting is more than just plopping your tushy in a seat. In rabbinic parlance, yoshvim often connotes sitting in the academy, sitting in the presence of the masters to learn. So arba midot biyoshvim, among those who sit, lifnei chachamim, before the sages. Chacham, Hebrew for wisdom. You've probably heard the Hebrew word chokhmah or chokhmah. Chokhmah means wisdom. Chachamim are the sages. So there are 4 kinds of types, 4 types of people who sit in the presence of the sages. There's the sifog, interesting word, which means a sponge, and the mashpech, which means a funnel, and the mishameret, which is a strainer, and the nafa, which is a sieve. So 4 implements that you might have in your kitchen. I have all 4 of these in my kitchen: a sponge, a funnel, a strainer, and a sieve. And they all have unique functions that are desirable for anyone who works in a kitchen. Let's see how the analogy holds up. So you've got the sponge, the funnel, the strainer, and the sieve. These are the four kinds of learners in the yeshiva. The sefog, or the sponge, shehu sofeg et hakol. The sponge is the one who sponges up, literally, sofeg from the word sponge, sefog, et hakol. That person sucks up everything, right? The person who just inhales learning and takes it all in. There's the mashpech, the funnel, which takes in at one end and lets out at the other. So I use a funnel every now and then. Normally, where I would use it is if we brew a pot of iced tea, which we do throughout the summer. Kelly does. She just takes her favorite herbal tea blend. She puts it in a pot with hot water. But getting a pot of iced tea into a pitcher, right? This is difficult without spilling iced tea all over yourself or your kitchen. So you get a funnel and you put it with a wide mouth and you put it in a jar or a pitcher with a narrow mouth and you pour it all in. But the point is that all the contents go in one end and come out the other. It does focus perhaps, but in one ear, out the other. That's the idea of a funnel. The strainer lets out the wine and retains the lees, or the sediment, right? So if you are using a strainer with something valuable, something precious, something wonderful like wine, unfortunately, all of the stuff that you want is what flows through, and you retain only the sediment. Whereas the sieve lets out the course meal and retains the choice flour. So a sieve, as opposed to a strainer, is, I would say, idealized here as the best analogous tool for the tool in your kitchen arsenal that best correlates to the kind of learning that the rabbis want to promote and extol here, namely a learner who can sift out the chaff and retain the choice flour, right? You want to get rid of the stuff that is not of value or of lesser value and retain that which is of higher value. What's interesting is that the rabbis don't explicitly promote one form of learning over another or extol one kind of learner over another, though I think the reader, that is to say, we, can make some reasonable inferences about which ones or one is preferred. So, okay, so first of all, how do you interpret the text? Do you have any questions about the text? Do you relate to the text on a level either personal or intellectual that you'd like to comment on? This is your chance, your first chance in today's class to chime in. Okay, yeah, Steve, hi, welcome.
Well, thank you. Do you think this is implying that some of the people who sit before the sages are not male rabbinic students, or it could be other people in the community?
Yeah, right. So I kind of began conjecturing that this may serve a double function. This is, if we accept the premise that I've presented us early on in our study and consistently throughout our study, that Pirkei Avot is kind of like a rabbinic training manual, then there is both, I think, the reasonable interpretation that this is to help rabbis encounter different kinds of rabbinic learners, in which case, right, in which case you might say, well, none of these is necessarily bad nor good. It's just you're going to meet different kinds of rabbinic learners, and there might be a utility to any kind of rabbinic learner or teacher. Or I think the more conventional interpretation that this has to do with students, not necessarily rabbis or rabbis in training, where a good teacher will have to work with different kinds of students, but some simply have a higher aptitude for retention. Others have a higher aptitude for sorting meaningful data from less meaningful data. So, I mean, to me, it seems like the sieve at the very end is the one that is given the most favorable standing in the estimation of the rabbis here, the one who is able to take in, the raw information, sort out what may not be valuable, and retain what will be valuable.
Right, thank you, but another interpretation of the reason there could be at least 4 different types of learning, which shows wisdom in itself, is how each of us, what Torah is telling us, that how you experience Torah and how you are meaningfully going to live your life in accordance with mitzvot, meaning that it's not enough to just become a Torah scholar if all that means is that you're very learned in Torah and Talmud learning, but you don't know how to incorporate it and live a life where you're following the values and principles as set forth. And I'm wondering, by having these different categories, it provokes you to think about that, so that you could say someone like a sponge is first absorbing it in, but as they have their life experiences, the wisdom of Torah will become clearer as you have encountered different life experience and how you interact with others.
Beautiful. I'm just going to let your comments stand for its own wisdom and clarity of expression. So thank you. That's great. I mean, without giving a definitive answer, I think that you're really on to a reason that the rabbis may have a preference for the kind of learning that differentiates between a person who is knowledgeable and a person who is wise. And the two should not really be confused for each other, right? There is a big difference between knowledge and wisdom, or being smart and being wise. And that wisdom, which is the preferred level of attainment intellectually and spiritually for the rabbis, and is extolled throughout the rabbinic literature as a virtue, even before rabbinic literature. I mean, the entire book of Proverbs is a long 31-chapter paean to wisdom as a virtue. Wisdom is not only about retention, it's very much about discernment. So, it's sort of the beautiful encapsulation as framed in the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the strength or courage to change the things I can. But of course, the word wisdom comes up in the third of the 3 lines of the serenity prayer, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? Wisdom is a quality, a virtue associated with the power of discernment. It does me no good if I can accept the things I cannot change and have the strength to change the things I can, but I can't tell the difference between the two, which means I might tilt at windmills trying to change things I cannot change, or be too complacent and accept the things that I actually do have the power to change. So let's hear from Susan Esther and then Audrey in that order, please.
When I saw the varied types of students, my first impression was the challenge was on the rabbi to motivate all of these disparate learning and interest. Having been an educator and having taught various classes, my challenge was not on the child, but it was placed upon me. And that's my first impression of what you presented.
That's great. It's great. And it's kind of it's a lead in, obviously, this is anachronistic for me to say, so, but modern educational theory spends a whole lot of time and toil in inculcating to educators or would-be educators the value of appreciating different kinds of intelligence, right? The conventional theory that there are only 2 kinds of students, smart ones and dumb ones, is really outmoded. And so even when I was in rabbinical school, where I had extensive training in education, it's a big thrust of rabbinic education today is teaching rabbis to be educators. And then you have people like Rabbi Citrin, who recently joined the temple as our Jewish Learning Lab director, who have special training in Jewish education, above and beyond what an average Reform rabbi might get. A lot of the attention, at least when I was in rabbinical school, 25, 26, 27 years ago, was on appreciating multiple intelligences and maximizing your students' ability to feel valued and to contribute by leaning into where they have intelligence. So there are some kids who may have a high musical intelligence, but are not great visual learners. And so using music as a classroom tool, these kids may excel at learning how to chant Torah, but not necessarily by learning how to decode the Hebrew. They may do better with an audio recording that they can play, or a YouTube video, like just knowing how to modulate your education for different kinds of learners, I would say meaningfully fits into the category that is introduced in this Mishnah, right? This is a wonderful launch pad or starting off point for a wonderful conversation about how Judaism respects the differences among learners without devaluing different kinds of learners. That's certainly a plausible way of going with this. Audrey Stoyer, and then we're going to go back into a supplemental text that I've brought for your consideration. Unmute kindly.
Okay, this is just a personal question about a word in the Hebrew.
Yes.
Did you say chocham?
Yeah, chocham is a wise person, and chochma, invert the final syllable with the vowel, is wisdom.
All right, so what would a chocham gedola be?
A great wise person.
Thank you.
Exactly, there you go. You've heard this phrase, and that's exactly what it
Yeah,
is.
and I think it was meant to impart the opposite.
Ah, used sarcastically. Oh, he's a real chocham gedola? Yeah, funny. Mm-hmm.
Well, I didn't think so, but thank you.
Well, it depends on who's being referenced here. Okay, so I'm going to show you a text that I thought highlights the value of the sieve, the one who retains what is most valuable, but sorts out what is not. So this paragraph comes from a book written in 1887 by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle called A Study in Scarlet. It's one of the great Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And the context is that Dr. Watson is kind of taking to task Holmes for not knowing the Copernican theory of the solar system. That's the specific context. Okay, and so he's kind of deriding his master for, how could you not know the Copernican theory of the solar system and how the planets revolve around the sun and not the other way around? And this is Sherlock Holmes's response. I'll read it to you. It says, I consider that a man's brain is a little like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. A fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has a difficulty in laying his hands upon it. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work. But of these, he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that that little room has elastic walls and can distend to any extent. Depend on it, there comes a time when for every addition of knowledge, you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts elbowing out the useful ones. So the brain attic passage from Sherlock Holmes. And the only reason I know this passage is not because I'm an avid reader of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. I never was. But if I'm not mistaken, Dad, this was your high school yearbook quote. Am I close? You have to unmute yourself.
As a matter of fact, you're right on one part, but it was my medical school yearbook quote.
There you go.
The other one was also from Sherlock Holmes, and the quote was, a 7% solution. Would you care to try some?
Aha. Okay, so tell us why you chose the brain attic quote, though. Like, do you remember what was speaking to you at this time?
Because after 4 years of medical school, you have accumulated so much information. Basically, you've learned a foreign language starting in about year 1 or 2, and you have gone through a dozen different specialties and gotten all of their arcana somehow mixed in there. And then it occurs to you that if you're going to specialize in one field or another, that there are some things that you will never retain and other things that you will need to know instantly. And as I practice medicine, in fact, it turned out to be very true. The things that I needed to know, even the arcana, the things that nobody except an anesthesiologist would care about, were always right at hand. Whereas
Hang on. Go on.
Whereas the other bits of medicine, I needed to know something about renal function, et cetera, you could get those, you could look those up, you could find them in some other context. So that was a very personally appealing sort of analysis, and one that I found to be over 40 plus years of practicing anesthesiology to be more true than not.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot. And see, I've learned something new about my dad. But that makes total sense that it was your med school yearbook and not your high school yearbook. See, yes. I think, you know, in high school and college, better to be a sponge. And then when you specialize and actually have to ply a trade or do the thing specifically that you are uniquely or especially good at doing, it is important to not let your brain attic get crowded with stuff that will not serve yourself or the other people you are trying to serve in your work. I have found the same to be true, that I'm surrounded by all of these impressive books, but I am far from conversant in, many of them. The trick to being a successful rabbi is often just knowing where to go when you don't know something. And then having a very, focused set of applicable knowledge. I think that I tend to be, my natural leaning, my natural aptitude is toward the sponge type. Like if we don't want to devalue one type over the other, I tend to be a sponge and try to use disparate sources of information to create meaningful Jewish living, which is why rare is the sermon of mine that will not also reference philosophy, politics, Shakespeare, other literature. Like, it tends to be fairly diverse set of knowledge that informs my work. But having said that, I think that, there's a detriment to that, which is that, your brain does get crowded with stuff, and finding the focus on what's really important, like where are my car keys, often gets crowded out. So Joe Levine, why don't you unmute yourself and chime in here, and then we'll look at the next Mishnah, please.
I'm not chiming in. I thought that was wonderful. I must have a copy of Sherlock's answer to Watson. Where can I get it?
Oh, yes. So I'll send a link in the chat window. It's a great quote, and I'll just pop it in there, and then you can copy it out of the chat window. Anyone on the class can just go to the chat box on Zoom and find it there. And if you have trouble accessing it, I'll be happy to email it, but there's the link. So it's just a pullout quote. And if you want the full book, it's A Study in Scarlet. That's the mystery. That's the Holmes mystery from 1887. Okay, so our next Mishnah will take us back to Avot, but we are now beyond the section of chapter 5 that frames its teachings as numeric mnemonics. So now we're just going to have kind of like a random smattering of teachings that will carry us through today's lesson, and probably will need to be picked up after the High Holy Days. So starting with 16. All love in Hebrew. Work with me with the Hebrew. I know that it's sometimes a little bit stretching for you, but it's great. Kol ahava. All love. Ahava is love. Sometimes you go to Israel and you see these beautiful statues, including the most famous one at the Israel Museum that says Ahava, just like the big sculpture. I think it was originally in Philadelphia, the love sculpture, L-O-V-E, written out as a square. Ahava, same thing in Hebrew. Kol ahava, like ve'ahavta. Kol ahava shehi tiluya badavar, that literally hangs on a thing. Here they say that depends on something. Depends is just from a Latin root meaning to hang, right? Like a pendulum, depends. Hangs. So kol ahava shehi tiluya. There's an example of brain knowledge that got in there. Like I have a thing for etymology. Is it necessarily the most useful thing for a rabbi to have? I don't know. I think you could be a perfectly capable rabbi without having an etymology fetish. Okay. Kol ahava shehi tiluya v'davar. Any kind of love that is dependent on something. And it says depends on a something. I like that. Batel davar. When the thing ceases, literally when the thing gets canceled out, batel ahava. Love gets canceled out. What the hell are we talking about? Let us find out in a minute. And all love that does not depend on anything, and I'm emphasizing the word thing, davar in the sense of a thing, some perhaps material or superficial or extracurricular benefit to a love relationship. We'll talk about what that thing might be. Love that does not depend on anything will never cease. Okay, now they're going to help us because they recognize this might need a more concrete example to make sense. What is an example of love that depended on a something? Such was the love of Amnon for Tamar. And what is an example of love that did not depend on anything? Such was the love of David and Jonathan. So this is a wonderful teaching, but only in so much as one is familiar with two other biblical narratives. One, the story of Amnon and Tamar, the other, the story of David and Jonathan. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that most of us in this class are familiar with the love between David and Jonathan, though we're going to look at it. And we're going to look at it first because it's fairly straightforward. But we're going to spend a little bit of time today learning the story of Amnon and Tamar, because if you haven't read the story of Amnon and Tamar, it is definitely a story you should know. And I'm going to go out on a limb again and say it is definitely not one that you learned as a kid in Sunday school, and you shall see why. So two love stories from the books of Samuel. Samuel is a large book that follows after Joshua in the order of the Hebrew scripture. So you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the 5 books of Moses or the Torah. Joshua is next. And then you go into the 2 books of Samuel, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. But in biblical times, this was one large book, and it was just broken into 1 and 2 because they hadn't yet come up with proper technology for making parchment scrolls that were light and flexible enough to use for more than like a certain volume at a time, right? So actually the quote unquote technology of a Torah scroll that is like 5 books bound on a single parchment that is stitched together on 2 wooden rollers, we don't see that kind of a Torah scroll until I think late 1st century, maybe even later. Before that, a Torah scroll referred to a single book of the Bible. And sometimes if it were a really big book, you'd have to break it into 2. 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. But it's not like it's not like somebody wrote Samuel and then 20 years later decided to write the sequel. It's all one book. Same with 1st and 2nd Kings, which is the next large section of the Bible. So we're going to look at just a couple of sections from the Samuels of the Bible, the first being chapter 18 of the 1st book of Samuel, which introduces us to the love between David and Jonathan. Jonathan is potentially in line for the throne. He is devoted to his father Saul, who is now the king of Israel. But Saul has gone mad and has pursued David in a kind of mad, relentless fury through hill and dale and chases him all over the country. Once he learns that God has supplanted Saul's kingship and David, whom Saul regards as a usurper, a boy king usurper, is the new anointed one who will take the throne. So when David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. And Saul took him into his service that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing and gave them to David together with his sword and bow and belt. David went out with the troops and he was successful in every mission. This is before the betrayal. This is before Saul goes mad. And Saul put him in command of all the soldiers. This pleased all the troops and Saul's courtiers as well. When the troops came home and David returned from the killing, the Philistine, this is David as a boy killing Goliath, the women of all the towns of Israel came out singing and dancing to greet King Saul with timbrels, shouting, and sistrums. The women sang as they danced and they chanted, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So already as a young man, David is getting better press than King Saul. Saul was much distressed and greatly vexed about the matter, for he said, to David they have given tens of thousands, and to me they have given thousands, right? He's complaining about the size of the crowd at his inauguration ceremony. Saul is very upset, very, very fragile ego, very upset that King David is now more famous than he is. All that he lacks is the kingship. David is like 8 when he slays Goliath. He's very easily threatened. From that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Okay, and then it goes into the jealousy, but one of the things that is a constant in David's life and career, and I don't see it anymore here, just the beginning of the chapter, which I'll return to, is the love between David and Jonathan, who ought to be loyal to Saul, but who actually puts his own life and status at risk to maintain a deep soul friendship with David. And Jonathan, I have to say, I do give my parents some credit for giving me a quote unquote good biblical namesake. There's almost nothing bad to say about Jonathan in the Hebrew Bible, and there aren't many other figures in the Hebrew Bible about whom you can say that. You know, David, which is my dad's Hebrew namesake, he's a very strong ruler, but let's just say, you know, he's a bit more of a challenging character to work with. Jonathan is almost like an unadulterated good guy. So nice work. But there you go. We know that David and Jonathan have a very special bond, and nothing that Jonathan says about David could be interpreted as an insult. So that's where the rabbis are going with this, is to suggest that the level of love, the kind of love between these two men, was not in any way what I would describe as transactional, right? Again, anachronistic here, but Martin Buber, in his what's widely regarded as his religious philosophic masterwork, Ich und Du in German, better known to you English speakers like me as I and Thou. In I and Thou, Martin Buber's entire religious conception of the relationship between God and humankind is framed along the different ways in which human love is experienced, or human relationship can be experienced. Most relationships, Buber argues, are of an I to it nature, the I-it relationship, which is, I went to Starbucks this morning and I met a barista. I actually admit I don't know her name. She knows my name because it showed up on the order when I paid with my app, and she addressed me as Jonathan. But she said, thank you, Jonathan. I just said, thank you so much. We have an I-it relationship though, right? She is purely a means to an end. She helped get my coffee. So transactional. Maybe if I become a regular at this Starbucks and she's there every day and we strike up a friendship, it could become something more than that. What Buber would call an I-you or an I-thou relationship, which is where the investment one has in the other is well beyond the transactional. It has no overriding character of what can you do for me? Or as the rabbis succinctly put it in the Mishnah we're looking at today, it is a love that is not about something. And I'm emphasizing the word as written, some, one word, thing, second word, and not something. Or the way they nicely put it here, a love that is about a something, right? So they're saying that the love between David and Jonathan is not about a something. This is a deep soul love. Jonathan's not, and it doesn't have to be a thing, meaning a physical thing. It could be love that is means to an end for, I love this person for what he can do for me, or for how, you know, my reputation improves when I am seen with this person, or any number of other, I would again call them transactional vectors that might be present in a relationship. The other kind of love, a love that depends on something, is exemplified in the rabbinic imagination by the love of Amnon for Tamar. So in case you don't know these names, Amnon is a male name, a boy name. Tamar is a female name or a girl name. And again, I'm not expecting that you're familiar with the story of Amnon and Tamar, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time reading it. But not for the faint of heart, trigger warning. So that this is a story about rape. This happens sometime afterward. Okay, and that's just a biblical way of saying, as Monty Python once said, and now for something completely different. Absalom, son of David. So Absalom, there are many themes in the David story that recur. David himself was seen as a usurper or a betrayer to Saul, and David himself, as an older king who's been in power for a long time, is beset by betrayers and betrayal, including by his own family, including by his own son, Absalom or Absalom. So Absalom is a usurper or a would-be usurper, pretender to the throne, who basically is vying for the kingdom with his own father. Absalom, son of David, had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, son of David, became infatuated with her. These are step siblings. David had children through, I think, 4 different wives. So Amnon is the son of one wife, Tamar, the daughter of another wife. So these are step siblings, but they are stepbrother and stepsister. Amnon was so distraught because of his half-sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. She was off limits to him. Amnon had a friend named Yonadav, the son of David's brother Shema. So that happens to be his cousin. Yonadav was a very clever man. He asked him, "Why are you so dejected, O prince, morning after morning? Tell me." Amnon replied, "I am in love with Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom. Yonadav said to Amnon, "Lie down in your bed and pretend you are sick. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat. Send in Tamar. I'm weak. I'm sick. Let her prepare the food in front of me so that I may look on, and let her serve it to me.'" Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. The king, this is David, came to see him, and Amnon said to the king, "Let my sister Tamar come and prepare a couple of cakes in front of me, and let her bring them to me." David sent a message to, again, his daughter from another wife, Tamar, in the palace. "Please go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was in bed. She took dough and kneaded it into cakes in front of him and cooked the cakes. She took the pan and set out the cakes, but Amnon refused to eat and ordered everyone to withdraw. After everyone had withdrawn, Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food inside and feed me." Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them to her brother inside, presumably inside the bedchamber. But when she served them to him, he caught hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, sister." But she said to him, "Don't, brother, don't force me. Such things are not done in Israel. Don't do such a vile thing. Where will I carry my shame? And you will be like any of the scoundrels in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not refuse me to you." In other words, if the king wants to authorize this as a marriage, okay, but she's worried about being defiled as a virgin, after which she will not be touchable by any man, right? She will be undesirable to any other man. That's the real concern. So the interesting thing is, picture, a girl of 12 or 13, 14 maybe, who's saying, "I don't want to do this, but if you want to ask your father's permission for my hand in marriage," that's something that David would be open to. But he would not listen to her. He overpowered her and lay with her by force. And remember that the reason we're reading this is because this is the paradigmatic story the rabbis want to hold of a love that is about a something, as opposed to a real or a pure love. And we'll talk about what that something is in a moment. Okay, so he rapes her. Verse 15. Then Amnon felt a very great loathing for her immediately afterward. It says, V'yisna'eha. He hated her. That's the very first word of verse 15. He hated her. Indeed, his loathing for her was greater than the passion he had felt for her. And Amnon said to her, "Get out." She pleaded with him, "Please don't commit this wrong. To send me away would be even worse than the first wrong you committed against me. That is to say, you raped me." But he would not listen to her. He summoned his young attendant and said, "Get that woman out of my presence and bar the door behind her." She was wearing an ornamented tunic, very interesting, by the way. It's the exact same terminology for the garment worn by Joseph, the one that makes his brothers very jealous, and that later is used as evidence of his death when the brothers get a hold of it, tear it up, dip it in goat's blood, and present it to Jacob, and he becomes bereaved, thinking his son was torn by wild beasts. She was wearing a ketonet pasim. Here's the Hebrew, these two words. She was wearing this ornamented tunic, or the quote, the proverbial coat of many colors. For maiden princesses were customarily dressed in such garments. His attendant took her outside and barred the door after her. Tamar put dust on her head and rent the ornamented tunic, not like rent the runway. That means she tore it, that she was wearing. She put her hands on her head, a sign of bereavement or mourning, and walked away screaming loudly as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Was it your brother Amnon who did this to you? For the present, sister, keep quiet about it. He is your brother. Don't brood over the matter." And Tamar remained in her brother Absalom's house forlorn. So Absalom protects her, but remember that Absalom was also at the center of this story. It was his friend who gave Amnon the advice that provided the pretext for the seduction, which became the rape. When King David heard about all this, he was greatly upset. Absalom didn't utter a word to Amnon, good or bad, but Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. 2 years later, when Absalom was having his flock sheared, so this is a long time for this grievance to simmer. 2 years. When Absalom was having his flock sheared at Baal Chatzor near Ephraim in the north country of Israel, Absalom invited all the king's sons, and Absalom came to the king and said, "Your servant is having his flock sheared. Would your majesty and your retinue accompany your servant?" This was like a big feast occasion. But the king answered Absalom, "No, my son, we must not all come, or will be a burden to you." He urged him, but would not go, and he said goodbye to him. Thereupon Absalom said, "In that case, let my brother Amnon come with us." To which the king replied, "He shall not go with you." But Absalom urged him, and he sent with him Amnon and all the other princes. Now Absalom gave his attendants these orders: "Watch, and when Amnon is merry with wine, and I tell you to strike down Amnon, kill him. Don't be afraid, for it is I who give you the order. Act with determination like brave men." Absalom's attendants did to Amnon as Absalom had ordered, whereupon all the other princes mounted their mules and fled. They were still on the road when a rumor reached David that Absalom had killed all the princes and that not one of them had survived. And at this, David rent his garment and lay down on the ground, and all his courtiers stood by with their clothes rent. And there's a lot more to this story, but I read a lot of it because, first of all, it's an amazing story. And I say this often: if you've never read the King David part of the Hebrew Bible, you must read it in translation. It's the Sopranos or the Godfather of the Hebrew Bible. It is awesome. It is saturated in blood, violence, betrayal, sex, intrigue, amazing characters, just edge of your seat, good stuff. So this is a very disturbing story. And it becomes, again, the paradigmatic example of love in the Bible that is not pure or holy, but a love, and even that word is a little bit, I think, distasteful to use, but I'm using it because it's the one that the rabbis use in Pirkei Avot, a love that is about a something. In this case, the something appears to be carnal lust, right? He's so in lust with his stepsister that he is physically sick over it. The remedy that is proposed is to lie with her, to seduce her and then rape her against her will, to defile her as a virgin, make her unavailable to any other man after him. And then immediately he detests her, right? He has his conquest and then discards her. And for this, of course, pays dearly. He is then set up by his half-brother Absalom for murder, together with all of his attendants. And it widens the rift among the family of David's sons and the rift between David and his sons. And it does set up the tragic climax and denouement of the David story, where David will, in fact, be betrayed, and Absalom himself will meet a very unpleasant demise, and David will go to his grave bereaved of his most beloved children. So it's a horrific Shakespearean tragedy kind of end to the story. But at its heart is this little story that they don't teach you in Sunday school about rape and incest. So, okay, that's the happy story of Amnon and Tamar. And it is contrasted with the love between David and Jonathan, which is one line, right? So you can see why the rabbis like these two examples. They both come from the same part of the Tanakh. One is a love that is not a love at all. It is merely a love that is a means to an end, and it ends very badly. And the other is a soul love that binds two human beings through thick and thin, and that nothing can shake. So it's really quite meaningful for me to share a little bit of my love of Bible with you in the context of Pirkei Avot. Comments or thoughts before we move on? Mom and Dad, you're the next hand, just unmute.
You know what happened to Tamar?
Of course I do. You have to read the rest of it yourself.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's not,
Great.
it's not in my brain attic.
Yeah, but it is in your Tanakh on your bookshelf.
That's true.
Yeah. So yeah, great ending. It'll take you another 15 minutes to get there. It's a redemptive ending, by the way. So in a way, Tamar lives and goes on, and I'll just leave it at that. Tamar gets, look, there's nothing that can compensate for the violation of Tamar, which is vile, as she says, and unspeakably horrific. But on the other hand, you do get a sense of redemptive justice by the end of the story, at least for Tamar. So, okay, moving on. Sandra Edlitz. Hi, Sandy. Unmute yourself kindly.
Thank you. Can you can you send the reference chapter and verse for us to
Absolutely.
read the rest of the story, please?
Absolutely. So
Very
you want to just look up Bible, any Bible will do, but I prefer a Jewish edition of the Bible, and it's I think it's 2 Samuel 18, but hang on, I do want to get that before I close the tab. This is 2 Samuel 13. So I'll just say 2 Samuel chapters 13 and 14.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so now back to Pirkei Avot, the two different kinds of love. And again, we're not looking in numeric mnemonics here. We're looking in kind of just a random smattering of aphorisms that tend to be phrased, I believe, as a kind of compare contrast. So we have good love, bad love. And the next one we're going to look at is good argument, bad argument. What is a good argument? What is a bad argument? Brief side note, many times couples engage with me several times before we stand under the chuppah together. And one of the things I've learned not to trust is a couple that tells me they've never fought. A couple that tells me they never fight is not necessarily providing me with a barometer of a loving, healthy relationship. I mean, maybe, but generally I say, well, it's not fighting is not a symbol, is not a sign of a healthy relationship. Knowing how to fight is very much a sign of a healthy relationship. And so the rabbis are attuned to this. And a lot of these, by the way, exist in the dimension of human relationship now. We're beyond just the attributes of character as learners or temperament. We're now into interactions, right? So two different kinds of love, two different kinds of argument. That's the context here. One of my favorite texts, maybe one of the most famous of the Pirkei Avot texts, you may be familiar with it. Kol machloket, great word, machloket. It is used by rabbis all the time to mean a debate or a dispute, machloket. For those of you Hebrew fans out there, the root of machloket is the root chet, lamed, kuf, the three inside letters of the word, which spell out chelek or chalak, which means portion or to apportion something. So a chelek is a portion, right? In fact, I learned this in my modern Hebrew class, which you know I took over my sabbatical. If you want to share your entree with your dining partner, you ask the waiter, Efshar lachlok et zeh, is it possible to apportion this? That's the verb they use. Literally means cut it in pieces. But so interesting that a machloket is a thing that divides, right? Or a dispute, a thing where clearly there are delineated sides or portions. So any argument or dispute, shehi l'shem shamayim, that is for the sake of heaven. We'll talk about what that means. It's a euphemism. Sofa lehitkayim, in the end, sof or sofa, its end, lehitkayim, is that it will endure. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Again, that feels awfully kind of nebulous, inchoate. What does this mean? Here are two examples. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy or dispute. Again, it's the same word machloket right here. Dispute, controversy. I don't love controversy. I like dispute, disagreement. The disagreement or dispute between Hillel and Shammai. Those names should be familiar to us who have studied Pirkei Avot because they pop up all over this book. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. Now, I didn't bring a tab that we could read the whole Korach story because I assume that there are at least 2 or 3 students here today who are not only Mishnah mavens, but who might be Torah mavens, who could neatly encapsulate the Korach story. Who is Korach? What is his story? Let's start there. Because in order to, okay, Dad, you're on.
Well, I'll give a stab. Was Korah a priest?
He was a, if not a Kohen, he was a Levite, but he's from the family, he's a first cousin to Moses and Aaron, which means he's from the tribe of Levi, which is the priestly family. So yes.
So Korah was aggrieved that he was not enabled or entitled to offer the ritual sacrifices to God, and he espoused the position that was not just, equitable, and fair, and after all, he should be permitted to do this because who was Moses to set himself up as the only person who could perform these rites? And Moses said, "All right, Korah, bring your best stuff. We're going to have a little contest." And they brought fire pans, which I guess were essential to performing the sacrifice. And in a nutshell, Korah got blasted in a celestial zapping and was not heard from again. And I think all of his clan was destroyed as well. But I mean, the essence of this comparison is that Hillel and Shammai debated in order to see what was the way to live a life of righteousness, although they disagreed on almost everything, whereas Korah was clearly an attempt to grasp power for its own right.
Beautiful. Great summary. Great summary. Thank you so much. Erudite and accurate. There's a little bit more. Korah also enlists other rebels to join him. And by the time he gets to Moses's front door at his tent, his grievance is about more than just who has the authority to offer the sacrificial rites. It becomes a whole grievance against, a whole litany of grievances against Moses and Aaron that starts there and then comes to include, by the way, who put you guys in charge anyway? Isn't everybody in the Israelite community holy? Which is, one way in which demagogues appeal to their followers, right? It's all about you. It's all about the people. I'm doing this because it's the will of the people, when in fact it's, I represent the common man, when in fact, if you look at Korach and his background, he was not a common man. So much so that the rabbis would go on to identify him in Midrash, this isn't in Torah, but in Midrash, later rabbinic literature, as the richest man in all of the wilderness community, having been the keeper of Pharaoh's treasury after the Exodus. So Korach, and there's even a Yiddish expression that means that guy's as rich as Korach. So Korach is an elite and an elitist who claims to be representing the will of the people, claiming that Moses and Aaron have unfairly usurped power from the people and religious authority. And then he enlists a bunch of other kvetchers who say, and by the way, why did you take us out of Egypt? Which is the old, like every time the Israelites get worked up, this is the thing which is a great affront not only to Moses and Aaron, but of course to God, because that's the whole plan. Like taking you out of Egypt is, as I often say, on the resume of God, that's God's first major accomplishment. The other one being gave you the Torah, right? So God does not like having God's reputation besmirched. When people complain, you took us out of Egypt, like it's a bad thing, God of the Hebrew Bible gets very, personally affronted. So in any case, Korach comes to represent any manner of grievances against the leadership, the leadership that has been personally authorized by God. But the signature complaint is exactly as you say it. Who put you in charge of the sacrificial offerings? Moses says, you're right, Korach. He said, oh, you've gone too far. We'll have a contest. We'll bring our fire pans and we'll see which one God really wants in charge. And it ends very badly for Korach and his company. There's a zapping, there's a plague, and then the most dramatic incident is where the earth opens up and swallows up Korach's followers. But it's not, it feels, most biblical scholars believe that there were several, at least 2, if not 3, rebellion narratives that were stitched into one. And if you're really a close reader, you can say, wait a minute, what exactly were they griping about? Like, it seems like they have too many gripes and there are too many people involved, but you got the essence of it. And thank you for bringing us back to Hillel and Shammai, who are held up by the rabbis as the opposite, the Antilog to Korach and his company, in that their argument, their dispute, their controversy, their disagreements actually served a higher purpose. They served a productive and even holy function for Jewish communal living, which was to further the way in which Judaism would be advanced in the ancient world, even though they disagreed on almost every point of law. And there's something in this about like the holiness of disagreement in Judaism, right? It validates the 2 Jews, 3 opinions approach to Judaism. And it makes it clear that that is not a defect of our tradition or our people, the fact that we argue internally, but rather something to be lauded, right? So the fact that Jews are known for argument is viewed in its proper context if the arguments are for the sake of heaven, which I read as serve a divine purpose or serve God's way of working in the world is sometimes through the power of argument. So I'd love to play this out just a little bit farther, which is why. What is it that's so great about argument, and why do the rabbis extol the virtue of an argument, at least one for the sake of heaven? And back to the serenity prayer, how do we have the wisdom to know the difference? How can we tell the difference between an argument for the sake of heaven and not for the sake of heaven? I'm going to start with Steve and assume that your comment or question is relevant to where we're going here, but take it away.
It is. I loved your phrase, the holiness of disagreement, because to me, having this class alone is evidence the brilliance and uniqueness of Judaism was God presenting the Torah not to Moses, but to the Israelites, to all the people. And the emphasis in Judaism on Jews becoming more learned and understanding of the Torah, that each Jew was being, in their individual capacity, empowered, become educated and informed. And that's a very powerful concept, because that was so contrary to religious practices and social practices at that time. And it's still somewhat unique, and that each of us, being created by God, are empowered and authorized and challenged by the covenant to truly take time to study and incorporate and live by the values of Torah. And the idea of having, quote, the holiness of disagreement means if you're disagreeing because you're trying to pursue learning and the truth and the values that matter, then that is a good act of learning to truly be able to understand Torah and how to apply it to your daily living.
Beautiful, Steve. Thank you so much. I was on the phone with a colleague and a friend of mine earlier this week who brought to my attention another teaching, and I have to ask her where it's found because I don't have chapter and verse, somewhere in the rabbinic literature, in which debate is likened to a whetstone, a sharpening stone, for cutlery, for knives. And debate is actually a sacred and valuable instrument in that it sharpens one's reasoning, critical analysis, and ability to make a compelling point. And therefore, if done in the proper spirit, two people who are debating with each other are actually sharpening each other. And the end result is that the idea that ends up prevailing and becoming halakha, Jewish law, is assumed by the virtue of its process to be the best of all possible ideas, right? So it's the way in which we arrive at enlightened reasoning is actually through debate. It even goes so far as to say that the optimal study format is where you have three people studying with each other. But it goes on to say that if you have two rivals who are debating with each other, and they are particularly sharp, and I'm using that word in all of its meanings, because sharp can mean cutting, but it can also mean somebody who's very bright, very learned, right? That guy's really sharp. But it can also mean somebody who lacerates. But in both senses of the word, if you have two people who are really sharp to each other and with each other, it's as if the third person is there. Like it has this kind of, it's even better. So that's why if you go into yeshiva and you don't hear vigorous argument, like yeshivas are boisterous places, you should be very suspicious of a yeshiva setting that is quiet, right? Now, again, this can, of course, go past a logical extreme to a point of aggravation. As one who has spent more than a little bit of time moderating Torah study at WRT, there's definitely a sacred and healthy balance between the contributions of the group and the different opinions that can be raised, and a kind of discourse that is more likely to cut somebody and leave them feeling hurt as opposed to heard, or, as we might say using a different image or metaphor, sheds more heat than light, right? So there is probably a balancing act, and you know, I prefer to be a rabbi than an umpire. So sometimes I have to like bring the discourse back to a place of respectful, not personal, not ad hominem attacks on each other, but let's really get sharp around critical reasoning that leads us to the best possible idea prevailing in any matter or any debate. Beautiful. So there you have it. Two different kinds of controversy. In my rabbinic work, you know, this is not esoteric. This is directly applicable and applied every week of my life. Trying to discern, like even at a staff meeting, I will often go into an internal place and go, is the debate we're having right now about how many cookies to put out on Sukkot, is this a machloket l'shem shamayim? Is this a debate for the sake of heaven, or is this not for the sake of heaven? Are we off in a place that's really not going to make us better rabbis or a better Jewish community? And you know, usually the debates we have at WRT don't get to the point of, you know, disrespectful in the way, you know, certainly not like Korach. Every now and then, though, there's a leadership challenge that comes along. You know, congregants want one thing, clergy want another thing, and you really have to figure out how to have a holy conversation around that, right? Why can't 900 people come to my son's bar mitzvah? I don't like your COVID policies. Okay, machloket l'shem shamayim here. We're going to do our best to celebrate Judaism without getting more people sick. That was more current a year ago. Okay, so let's dive back in. We have time for a couple more of these Avot Mishnayot. So we're every dispute for the sake of heaven. And this is, again, another one of these two ideas that are juxtaposed. One is viewed as a virtue, one is viewed as a vice. One's good, one's bad, and they make a nice compare contrast. So here it is. Okay, just looking in the Hebrew, kol hamizakeh et harabim. Anyone who, mizakeh is a wonderful word. It comes from the Hebrew root zayin kaf he, zacha, which means to merit or to receive reward. So anyone who, in this case, causes the masses to deserve reward. as they translate it here a little bit more eloquently, whoever causes the multitudes to be righteous. But it's not just righteous. It actually says to be meritorious of some kind of divine recognition or reward. That's where the root comes from. Anyone who causes the multitudes to be righteous, ein chet ba al yado, will not have sin accrue to him. No sin will come on to, literally unto his hand. Here it says sin will not occur on his account. So in other words, if you are toiling in the vineyard of moving great numbers of people toward righteous behavior, it's almost as if you yourself, I don't know if what it means, sin will not come upon his hand. Or as they say here, sin will not occur on his account. I can let you chime in with your thoughts once we've read this Mishnah. Possibly it means that you become, if not impervious, you're given a little bit more good grace, as, you know, sort of like the balance is very much in your favor, that your own foibles may be excused more if you are engaged in the work of bringing other people to righteousness. All right, you can imagine why rabbis would take this text seriously, right? Because this is very much about what I would call a rabbinic ultimate. What does it mean to be a rabbi? I'm not talking only personally, I'm talking especially about what the rabbis who wrote Pirkei Avot had in mind, and their pupils, the rabbis whom they were training to be rabbis. This isn't only about raising up disciples who are learned, it is about moving communities to be righteous. And therefore, the rabbis, I think, want to put in an encouragement saying, look, it's not that your own sin will be excused, it's that in some way, maybe you will be more impervious to sin, or you will be given the benefit of the doubt, or maybe even that simply doing the work of making other people righteous provides righteousness benefit to you. Dad, you want to chime in there?
Maybe in a kind of a meta context, it might mean that you're not going to be held responsible for unintended consequences.
Yeah, and that's helpful because the word sin, which is always problematic in translation for us English speakers in the 21st century with 2,000 years of Christianity behind us, where sin really means something different than it does in biblical and rabbinic Judaism. As I think I've taught before, the word chet for sin is an archery term. It literally means to miss the target. So sin is much more in the Jewish tradition about accidental wrongdoing than it is about premeditated transgression. So yeah, nice. That's consistent with my read as well. And whoever causes the multitudes to sin. So if you're in the business of leadership, bringing other people to transgression, they do not give him the ability to repent. In other words, you're actually preventing yourself from teshuvah. Now again, and all of these follow the same format. They put this kind of broad statement together. If X, then Y. If, you know, not X, then not Y. Example from the Bible. That's the format of all the Mishnahs we're looking at today. Cause and effect on one end, cause and effect the opposite, biblical examples to illustrate. Moses was righteous and caused the multitudes to be righteous. Therefore, the righteousness of the multitudes is hung on him. And they give a proof text quote, he, meaning Moses, executed the Lord's righteousness and God's decisions with Israel. In other words, it is Moses who is imputed with the righteousness, not only personally doing God's righteous, behavior, but also for the whole community. Moses led the Israelites to become righteous, and therefore his own personal rectitude is enhanced by this greater work of moving other people to righteousness. Who is Moses's Antilog or contrasting figure from the Bible? It's a fellow you probably don't know as well as Moses. And that's by design, of course. The Bible doesn't want you to know him as well. It's a fellow named Jeroboam, or Yiravam in Hebrew, from the book of Joshua and Judges. Joshua? No, Judges. Jeroboam. Oh, Kings. There you go, Jeroboam. Jeroboam sinned and caused the multitudes to sin. Therefore, the sin of the multitudes is hung on him. For it is said, for the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, and which he caused Israel to sin thereby. What was Jeroboam's great sin? Just a little biblical background. Jeroboam is one of the successors to Solomon. So there are three kings in sequence of the unified kingdom of Israel, according to the books of Samuel and Kings. Saul, whom we've talked about already today, Saul's successor / usurper, David, David's youngest son through Bathsheba, Solomon. Solomon is the one who builds the temple, but Solomon is also known, in addition to being distinguished as brilliant and capable and very wise, he is also known for being ruthless with his own family and with the people. And he institutes corvée, so basically he enslaves the population to build the temple, and the people hate him. And he is succeeded by his sons, and the kingdom splits. Jeroboam becomes the king in the north, and Rechavam becomes the king in the south. And from that moment forward, the kingdom will be split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Judah was its own tribe, teams up eventually with Benjamin to become kind of like a super tribe. But the 10 tribes in the north will eventually become the lost tribes of Israel when the Assyrian conquest takes place in the latter part of the 8th century BCE. Jeroboam, among other things that the Bible frowns upon, sets up 2 shrines in the north and builds golden calves there and tells people to worship at the shrines with the calves. Now, there's a whole lot more that explains that. If you're a biblical historian, there's actually a lot of context that explains why what Jeroboam was doing may not have been as impious as the Bible believes it to be. But that's a machloket l'shem shamayim for another day. That's a holy dispute we can have on some other class. For today, you just need to know that the Bible itself regards Jeroboam as one of the baddest of the bad, because he leads the entire tribal confederation in the north, the so-called 10 tribes of Israel, to sin against God by worshiping golden calves at unauthorized shrines other than Jerusalem. Okay, that's Jeroboam, and he is particularly bad not only because of his personal effrontery to God, but because of the way in which he moved the masses, right? So some of this is about what I would call the force multiplier effect of leadership, right? The idea that the leader must be held accountable not only for his or her own conduct, but also for what the people are doing. And in leadership, the whole idea is to marshal people toward a unified outcome that the leader can motivate the people to follow. In synagogue life, this is one of the most powerful aspects of being a congregational rabbi, which is that it's not only about individuals having a meaningful spiritual journey, which of course is part of my work and part of what I like to promote. It is also about the force multiplier effect of leading a congregation and the things you can do only as a congregation that you cannot do at the individual level, right? One person can feed one other person, or maybe a family, or if they're particularly generous and dedicated, maybe several families for a certain period of time. But if you do a food drive with an entire congregation that in the matter of 2 days generates 10,000 pounds of donated food, you can feed the county for a month, right? So that's what I mean by the moving people to righteousness and the force multiplier effect. And then you extrapolate from that somebody like a Moses who had 600,000 Israelite adults of fighting age, and the things you can do when you're that kind of a leader. It's also, of course, the danger of leadership, because if you're not a Moses and you're a Jeroboam, the multiplication effect, the force multiplier effect of evil is also dramatic. That's my take. Susan Esther, and then Audrey, please. Just unmute yourself kindly before you speak. Thank you. We're waiting on that unmute.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
The overall impression I got today is, from the various stories, is a definition of sin. And I'm thinking of Tamar and how her violation, which is a sin, was justified by a king by saying, well, if you'll marry him, then it's, and I'm thinking of those women who stay with men who've abused them. So I'm wondering, from a rabbi's standpoint, how do you justify this sin in today's world? And what lesson can we learn from her that will help us understand that if a man approves it, then it's okay?
Well,
And
thank you.
with all due respect, I still enjoy your classes.
Thank you. Thank you. No. And if it is okay, if anyone is vexed by, what we're learning in class, that's like, if it sharpens you in a good way. Look, there are all sorts of powerful figures whose sin is protecting those who do evil, right? So the force of powerful rabbinic leaders defending husbands in the ultra-Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community, who prevent their wives who are abused or neglected or otherwise mistreated in a marriage from getting the divorce that Judaism is supposed to permit them to have, creating the condition you're describing, which is known in Jewish law as the condition of the aguna, literally the chained woman, the woman who cannot escape from an abusive marriage because she cannot secure a get, which has to be given to her by her husband. And if a get is not given freely by the husband, who refuses to divorce her, in other words, a rabbinical beit din, or a rabbinical court, can be convened, 3 rabbis, 3 authorities, to compel the husband to give the get. The problem is, in some ultra-Orthodox communities, very few, but it's a real problem for women in these communities, the rabbis refuse to compel abusive husbands to give a get. And so therefore, these are rabbis who are using their considerable power and influence to protect abusers. Or any number of higher up authorities in religious life. And by the way, Reform Judaism is not exempted from this condemnation that I'm about to offer. We can think about any number of high up religious authorities who protect sexual abusers by just moving them from parish to parish, as opposed to allowing their victims to have the justice they so deserve. So you're right. I mean, so those are some of the analogous scenarios where the power of the leader to perpetuate either righteousness or evil is on very clear display. Audrey, why don't you chime in next?
All right, going back to the last text about the righteous leader, I have a problem with Moses because in the end, God wouldn't permit Moses to go into the promised land because he had struck a rock or something too hard. He was upset with God. So, I mean, is that such a sin that he wasn't forgiven?
I sense that narrative, unreferenced explicitly in this Mishnah, is nevertheless percolating somewhere in the consciousness of the rabbis who wrote this. I think that one possible explanation is that the rabbis are very much aware, as you are aware, of the fact that Moses, especially in the last part of the Torah, is distinguished chiefly for transgression and punishment, right? The transgression at the rock tends to be the location, the incident, the precipitating incident. He strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock. The context is the Israelites aren't not just thirsty, they're going to die in the wilderness if they don't get water. And they're clamoring for water. And Moses and Aaron treat them the way they have been forced to treat them along the way for 40 years, which is, we're sick and tired of you rebels. So they lose their cool. And Moses in particular gets up and says, all right, rebels, shall we produce water from this rock? And instead of doing what God told him, he smashes the rock with his rod, and water does come out. But God basically says, because you refuse to sanctify me in the presence of the Israelites, you will not be permitted entrance to the promised land. So Audrey, you would not be the first, and I'm sure you won't be the last, to observe that, boy, it does feel like a fairly dramatic punishment given the transgression. And it could be, I would argue, that that cognitive dissonance, that the rabbis too feel a sense of, really, Moses, for all the good he did, it's going to be erased by this one minor transgression. He hit a rock instead of speaking to it. If you want to go in that direction, and if you want to believe that such a line of thought might inform this Mishnah, I think you have all the reason in the world to do so, because the rabbis are basically saying, in the final analysis, Moses is the good that Moses did. Again, think force multiplier. The net good that Moses did for the Jewish people, with the Jewish people, and there through the Jewish people to the rest of the world,
Right.
far outweighs any sin that was personally imputed to him, his personal transgression at the rock. I think that's entirely consistent with what this Mishnah is teaching. Now I'm arguing with myself. No, I could use another whetstone, but the counterpoint, I think, the more I've studied the character of Moses, particularly toward the end of his life, and the more I've reflected on the burdens and beauty of rabbinic leadership, with Moses being the paradigmatic rabbi in the Jewish tradition, the more I am both sympathetic to Moses for losing his cool with the people, and I am sympathetic to God for saying, you can't lead anymore. In other words, I think that the actual, I've come to believe that Moses's real transgression, and I don't even like that word, is that he had become too brittle to discern between a congregation that was dying of thirst and a group of pesky rebels that he needed to literally treat with the stick as opposed to the carrot. I mean, what he was unable to recognize is that his people were in a moment of grave threat to their survival, and he treats them like rebel children. And I think that that's sometimes what happens. You know, like if you've led the people for long enough and you're kind of beaten down by them and you're burned out, you can react in anger and miss the opportunity to say, wait a minute, their lives are at stake here. And I think it's okay I think it's also okay that God says to a Moses who's, 119 years old at this point, or 120, it's like, it's time for somebody new. Like, your leadership is no longer effective. Now, that's an easy thing for a young man like myself to say. When I'm 119, and if I become cranky like old Moses did, and somebody says to me, it's time for you to step down, all I can say is I hope I can hear that as coming from a place of machloket l'shem shamayim. I hope it's coming from a pure and holy place. Thank you.
It'll come from Doug.
Halavai. Okay, Steve.
I think another learning in this passage is the critical importance of how to create a righteous community. That the covenant from God, God's love and main message with the covenant, is not just for each of us individually to try to strive towards holiness, but how each of us should be contributing to making sure we create community and continue, like Tikkun Olam, to repair and nourish community to be faithful. So to me, it's not the emphasis on Moses, but on the concept of a righteous community. I mean, that each of us, when we conduct our lives, it's not enough that what we do individually, but how do we interact with the people around us to try to show respect and of people, but also to encourage good behavior and values by the people around us.
Excellent insight, Steve. I so value that, because it takes me into my segue to my final comment of the morning. And so we've accomplished all the text reading I wanted to today, and thank you for both the source text and the digressions into the Tanakh that I enjoyed sharing with you. I think that's exactly right. This is about more than just individual rectitude. This is about how do we create righteous community, and that, I think, effectively explains all of the learning that's come before it in sequence. That now you can look at a chunk of Pirkei Avot as, aha, the rabbi is being taught to master and understand different kinds of individual temperaments and the way they interact, different kinds of learning styles, the importance of love that is not transactional, but that is at the soul level, the David and Jonathan level, and argument that is for the sake of heaven, right? So now look at like the previous 10 Mishnayot or more, and you see a kind of building of a master thesis up to the ultimate aim, which is the creation of righteous community, and the role of the leader in marshaling those forces of individual people toward doing great work at great scale, right? So this I think is actually at the higher reaches of what the rabbis want to teach their disciples about what it means to be a rabbi. It is about more than just, somehow you have to find a way to move people into the same direction of creating righteous community together. And how you do that while still appreciating and valuing the diversity within community, which is what all the previous texts have been about, is both a great challenge and a great opportunity. So on that note, I've concluded my remarks this morning with immense gratitude for the way in which you have all sharpened me and one another through our constructive conversation. You did the thing that the rabbis told us to do today. So well done, well done. And I think that's wonderful reflection as we enter the month of Elul, which begins Friday night with sundown. We start 4 weeks of spiritual preparation for the holy season. Rosh Hashanah, I hesitate to add, begins 4 weeks from this coming Sunday night. So I hope that between now and then you will have occasions to feel joyful and relaxed in the waning weeks of summer, to remain healthy and safe as COVID still continues to be a thing. And I know many people who are sick right now, praying for their well-being. And most of all, that you are getting your spirits and your spiritual life in good order to enter a new season of awe and the possibilities that a new year will bring. So a very early Lishana Tova. Sandra, do you want to say something before I wrap up?
Please, I hate to, and yours should be the way we end, but could you please repeat the date and time and subject of what you will start after the holidays?
Yeah, October 13th, Thursday morning, will be our resumption of our study. I want to double check that so that you don't quote me on it falsely. But I think that's when we are coming back together.
Thank you very much.
Yep, because the 6th is the day after Yom Kippur, so that's a mental health day for your rabbi. And then a week, it's the middle of Sukkot week. And we're going to continue our study online throughout the fall to just before Hanukkah. And then we have other different kinds of fun learning over the winter term kind of learning, a little bit more light Jewish arts, culture, movies, fun things like that. Some special guests arriving. And then TBD, if the conditions permit, we might go to a hybrid format in the spring where you can come in person, but we'll set up a special, I'm going to work on an enhanced mechanism for doing both online and in person. But we need a few months to actually get the technology and the support staff to help me with that. So TBD, we're online from October to December, and I look forward to seeing you then, if not before.
Thank you.
What is the name of the course again, John?
The course is called The One Jewish Book That Will Change Your Life.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yashikov, Jonathan.
Baruchim to you. Baruch
Thank
haba.
you very much,
Thanks, folks.
John.
What's the book?
Book is Pirkei Avot. the catch is that you're already studying it. It's just a rebranding. It's new Coke. Bye, guys.
Great job. I always appreciated Sherlock Holmes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank my dad.
Thanks.
Yeah, I used to love Sherlock.
Marge and Doug, thank you for bringing us Jonathan.
Thanks,
I still use that attic analogy all the time.
Brain attic. There you go. All right. Good Yontif, everyone. Almost.
Good Yontif.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Toda Rabah.
Thank you.